I.Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 2, Part 1, Between Life and Death, read by Natalia Bызова. The battle ended as if suddenly, and an ominous silence crept across the hollow. It was broken only by the rare, gradually fading groans of the wounded. When the dawn broke, the first to rush to the battlefield was the enemy tank. Tapping with the caterpillar treads, it stopped almost next to the scattered bodies. A Nazi in dark overalls with a pistol in his hand leaned out of the opened hatch. What was the first thing that caught his eye? Foreign soldiers scattered on the grass, still clutching rifles in their cooling hands. Suddenly, the head of one of them lifted slightly and fell to the ground again. Then the Nazi pointed a pistol at him and began to aim. A shot cracked dryly, and the rifle fell out of the soldier's hands. It was Volodymyr Stermerov. 12 fragments of an exploding mine dug into his body, but all the wounds, as it turned out later, were relatively minor. This time the bullet scratched at the fingers of the hand gripping the rifle. Probably a cautious fascist had aimed at it. Then the tank growled and lunged, pouring smoke and stinking fumes of the fallen. I had never seen or had this incident at the top of the hollow. It was told to me by Volodya when, after a while, we were together again. I don't know if I was too weak from loss of blood or I was exhausted for a day without food and sleep, but suddenly I woke up from a jolt in the side. In front of me were two Germans with machine guns in their hands, and some women at a distance. I have to admit, for the first time, I was seized by a feeling of fear, as if a cold blew behind my back. We had been told about the bullying of the prisoners of war by the Nazis, so everybody would inevitably become numb. One of the soldiers bent down and searched my empty pockets. Then, taken by the arms, they dragged me to the nearest buildings. Near the respite houses, the women came closer. I asked for a drink, and they brought me some water in an aluminum mug. And then they started asking the Germans to bring me into the house. For some reason, they agreed, and I ended up in the living room. The hostess of the house, aged 45, and her daughter, aged 13, were my first saviors. They knew us cadets well, since the town was nearby. Mother spread the bed right on the floor and covered it with a white sheet. I asked her not to do this, as I was covered in dust and blood. But they didn't listen to me, and soon reddish spots began to creep across the sheet. They offered me something to eat. They brought bread with butter and jam, but there was no appetite. I bit, but for some reason I could not swallow. Soon everything I had endured, despite the excruciating pain in my leg and a burning sensation in my back, knocked me down like anesthesia, and I fell asleep, or maybe I lost consciousness. I woke up from screaming. It was the same two Germans yelling at me. The hostess asked them. She didn't let me go. She said that there would be a doctor whom she had run after, and the daughter was crying quietly on the sidelines. Then the German pushed the mother away with the butt. They put me on a martial cloak and carried me for interrogation. I will not reproduce this terrible test in detail. I will only say that the actions of a mad dog are difficult to explain. First, the brute with the officer's shoulder straps hit me, lying and bloody, with the boot in the side. An officer, commissioner, he yelled, pulling a pistol from his holster menacingly. Probably by the cadets' buttonholes with the yellow edging, which were then like the lieutenants, and by a special military uniform, not like a soldier's. He took me for an officer or political instructor. For when the translator came running, He again snatched these two words out of his seething throat with anger, in addition poking the toe of his boot under my chin. I didn't care at that moment. I was exhausted to such an extent that death would be the best escape from further trials. And instead of answering, my lips said the same thing: drink, drink, drink. Then the Nazi leaned over and, shouting something, thrust his pistol into my forehead so that blood ran down my face. And the translator, already in Russian, asked, "Why did you attack the German soldiers?" At this time, a senior officer with twisted shoulder straps entered. They all jumped up. He listened to the report, then croaked something, and they carried me out into the yard. If he had not come there in time, my torturer perhaps would have finished me off, since from his behavior I understood that it was his subordinates that we partially had snapped that night. I soon found myself in a former horse stable, lying on the straw next to Volodymyr Stemerov and Samuil Kalinkovich. Where are the other wounded? There had been more of them, but what if the German tanker had shot only Stemerov, or something similar someone else had done? But why did I stay alive? Was I mistaken for the murdered? Or maybe the grass at the bottom of the hole had hidden my half-dead body from the predatory gaze? Who had found me in it, the Germans or those women? Maybe their presence had taken the cold muzzle of a machine gun away from me. Although Volodya had not very dangerous wounds, there were many of them, and he could hardly move. And Samuil, without regaining consciousness, died at night. He was a Jew, originally from Poltava, a brave, good comrade. When we were leaving Poltava, his mother somehow had found out about that and came to the train. Small, black-haired, and no longer young, she kissed him goodbye and cried. And he calmed her down. Looking at her, we thought about our mothers, who were far from us. In the room, together with us, the Germans locked several dozen more soldiers who had been captured somewhere, but there were no cadets among them. Until the end of the day and the next night, we lay in that stinking prison without food or medical assistance. The soldiers shared their last sips of water with us and changed their bloody bandages. The weather was hot, and the stuffiness mixed with the stench became unbearable. My leg was swollen and heavy. I was in pain. Thirst tormented. I was delirious. Endlessly, I dreamed of water pulsating from a spring and a train to which people were running, and I crawled behind them, stretching out my hands and shouting, "Take me, take me." It was the most dreadful night of my life, when the young organism was fighting death. In the morning, the door opened, and we smelled of fresh air. The guards took the prisoners into the courtyard and began to sort by nationality and set the dogs on us. I crawled out with difficulty. The sentry looked sideways but did not touch me. The coolness was almost salvation. I felt a little better. Soon women began to approach the prisoners from all over. They had bread and other food in their hands. Some stopped near me, asked where I was from and whether they could send them a message. Then they put something edible or sweet in front of the face. I remember two in black robes, like nuns. They looked, crossed themselves and said, "Young, young." And at the same time, they remembered God and wiped away their tears. A nurse suddenly appeared from somewhere, all in white, with a red cross on her kerchief and with a suitcase in her hand. She bandaged Volodya and me well and promised to take us to the nearest hospital, and then went to look for more wounded. After a while, she returned and began her chores. The sentry didn't seem to mind, but he didn't give any prisoners or war porters. And then he talked to someone and singled out 3 people. They carried me first, accompanied by a Fritz with a submachine gun. They brought me to the Red Cross hospital. The head physician in it was an Armenian Serbikian. He immediately put me on the table. On the back, between the shoulder blades, near the very neck, there was a large swollen spot, obviously from being hit by a heavy stone. Below, the doctor found 2 small fragments. He pulled them out, and the back was healed quickly later. From one splinter, the scars remain to this day, and from the impact of some object, a whitish spot. The leg was not doing well. At the bottom, it swelled to the size of a head, and from the hole in the joint area, white bones were visible like coarse corn. I was convinced that they would cut it off and began to ask to be taken away below the knee. And the doctor looked at me and said, "You will still dance on this leg." I took those words for the usual method of calming, but they turned out to be to some extent prophetic. The nurse took my bloody clothes and gave me a sick leave. She confidently said that they would have me listed as a civilian, only I had to write down my local home address in the book. Do you have a girlfriend in the city? I named the street Kirpichная, building 48, where Katya Головинova lived with her mother. It was on the outskirts of the city, which was called Nahalovka. However, I stayed in that hospital for only a few days, since they did not have funds for the treatment and nutrition of the patients, and I was transported to a former military hospital near the flower garden. I don't remember its number. It was called the 5th Sanatorium and also Eagle's Nest. About 300 wounded whom our army had not been able to take out, as well as several doctors, nurses, and nannies were left there. The head physician was Zhukova, a tall, stout woman about 55 years old, and my treating surgeon was Ivan Ivanovich Kiselyov. They wrote me down in the book who I was, where I came from, what unit I served in, where and what wound I had received. There I got a 5-fold bone scrubbing. And later, when the Germans took us from Pyatigorsk, Ivan Kiselyov had put the cast on the leg just in case. He said that everything would be fine, but the heel was deformed and I might have to wear prosthetic shoes. Many of the wounded, having been healed, crawled in all directions, mainly to the women they knew. The medical staff provided every assistance in that, but the hardest ones had nowhere to go, and we lay without knowing what awaited us the next day. And alarming rumors circulated right up to the export out of the city and execution. Once the Germans walked through the chambers, examining the walls, windows, doors, and on the next day we were expelled from the city to the former hospital for the mentally ill. At a new place, we again met with Volodya Shtemerov. He already walked through the wards and found me. All his wounds were healed, only the punctured fingers of his hand were not. But he was about to leave for a girl he knew. How he did it, I don't know, but he got out and told Katya Головинova where I was. Volodya, on his father's side, was from the Volga Germans, deported by Stalin to the Kazakh steppes at the beginning of the war. But his mother was Russian, and he presented himself as Russian. Therefore, probably, he was not subjected to reprisals. He remained at the school. His parents were fishing on the Volga. He himself knew many varieties and qualities of fish well, and in his leisure hours, he sometimes fed us cadets with stories about delicious red fish. Our situation was getting worse every day. There were no food supplies and no medicine. The hospital workers who were still with us began to go to the villages for potatoes and vegetables. But that could not last long. Once the head physician Zhukova walked through the wards and announced that the Germans were going to take us somewhere, and we got worried. It was at that time when Katya Holovinova found me here. I remember it was Wednesday, a sunny day. A nurse entered the ward and smiling mysteriously said that there were guests to me. I was delighted guessing which ones, for there was only one girl who could search for me in this city. It was a long time ago. All of us at one time loved someone or were fond of them. Katya and I had met in the best years of our youth and reached out to each other. She was 2 years younger than me and had just finished high school. However, the hard times of war separated us. I was captured and she later married another one. The door of the ward opened and Katya entered with her Armenian friend Oля. I greeted them with the smile I was capable of at the time. But my appearance was probably pitiful, a thin, pale face, sunken eyes, growing hair. I almost could not walk because when lowering my leg, the wound still ached and bled. Therefore, at first the girls shed tears and then they fed me stewed potatoes and pancakes. And at the end, they started talking about how to get me out of there and take me to Katya's place. I agreed. But that was not easy to do since there was a sentry at the front door. We decided the following. If we failed to beg or bribe with vodka, they would drive up from the back of the building with the hand trolley, and with the help of the nurse, I would go down from the second floor to the first and climb out through the window. But it all ended with the fact that 2 days later, the Germans drove up covered cars and we all ended up at the railway station in tightly closed calf carriages guarded by SS men. While partying, the hospital staff did everything possible to alleviate our life. For each on the stretcher, the hostess sister laid down a loaf of bread, and other women what they could, pies, cakes, fruits, onions. I no longer remember the names or surnames of those people, but I would like to bow low to them. In the harsh conditions of the occupation, without being paid for their labor, they looked after us for 2 months and parted with tears in their eyes. On the evening of October the 20th, 1942, the train full of groans and curses moved off. For many of us, that was the beginning of a painful journey to the next world. Previously, this chapter written in Russian was related to the first part of memoirs. This was their ending. Now I have introduced it to the second part, which reveals my being in captivity.